Hi guys! Today's story is about a man who couldn't be woken up, not even by a hired assassin. Before we begin, hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and let's get started. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. So grab something warm, dim the lights, and let's dive into this sleepy yet dangerous tale from the past. The Sleepy Emperor, Memoirs of an Assassination, slept through recollections of Marcus Flavius, Severus, Secretary of the Imperial Chancery, on the events of the 7th year of Emperor Valentinian III's reign, Anno Domini 447, the 189th year from the founding of Constantinople. 30 years have passed since that night when the empire nearly crumbled from nothing more than the sound of snoring. 30 years, and I still wake to the sound of footsteps in corridors, those same soft, careful steps that should have been the last our sovereign ever heard. But he did not hear them. He slept so deeply that he slumbered through his own intended end. Now, with hair the colour of ash and fingers that barely grip the stylus, I record this history not for glory, not for vindication, but because someone must remember how thin was the thread upon which our world's fate hung, and how strangely the wheel of history sometimes turns, not from great decisions and heroic deeds, but from simple human exhaustion. Chapter 1. The Palace That Never Slept. The weight of purple silk grows heavier with each passing year. I learned this truth not from wearing it myself, heaven forbid such presumption, but from watching how it bent the shoulders of Valentinian III, Augustus of the Western Empire, in those final months before the conspiracy that should have ended everything. It was the spring of 447, and Ravenna's marshes exhaled their familiar scent of decay and new life. The palace corridors echoed with the constant shuffle of sandaled feet, the whispered Latin of clerks, the distant clatter of the kitchen slaves preparing the third feast of the day. Everything moved with the relentless rhythm of an empire that devoured gold, grain, and men in equal measure. I had served in the imperial chancery for 12 years by then, long enough to recognize the particular quality of silence that meant trouble. It was not the comfortable quiet of efficient administration, but the held breath of men calculating odds and weighing loyalty against survival. You learned to taste such things in the air of palaces, like the metallic tang that comes before storms. The emperor's condition had been worsening throughout that winter. What the court physicians called an excess of melancholic humours manifested as a bone-deep weariness that no amount of rest could cure. Valentinian would sit through morning audiences with his chin dropping toward his chest, startling awake when a petitioner's voice rose too high, or when his chamberlain's staff struck the marble floor. His eyes, once sharp as a hawk's, had grown heavy-lidded and distant. We who served closest to the throne developed an unspoken choreography around these episodes. Marcus Antonius, the chief chamberlain, would clear his throat meaningfully when the emperor's breathing grew too regular. The scribes learned to speak their reports with theatrical emphasis, their voices carrying just enough volume to penetrate the fog of imperial exhaustion. I myself became expert at timing my approach with documents for the moments when consciousness flickered back into those imperial features. The palace itself seemed to conspire in enabling this strange dance. Built from the bones of an older Roman villa, it retained the intimate scale of a private residence despite housing the machinery of empire. Corridors curved in unexpected directions, leading to chambers where afternoon light slanted through windows of real glass, a luxury that still amazed those of us born in humbler circumstances. The floors were paved with intricate mosaics depicting scenes from Virgil and Homer, their tiny stones worn smooth by decades of imperial feet. In the emperor's private quarters, Persian carpets muffled footsteps, and the walls were hung with silk tapestries that depicted scenes of military triumph from more glorious days. The air always carried the scent of the sandalwood incense that burned constantly in the small shrine to the household gods, a private concession to older traditions that the emperor's Christian court would have found troubling had they known. It was in these chambers that I first noticed the peculiar quality of Valentinian's sleep. Unlike the fitful rest of most men burdened with power, his slumber was profound, almost mystical in its depth. Once unconsciousness claimed him, it seemed that all the noise of empire could not wake him. Servants could drop silver vessels with resounding clangs. Guards could march through the adjoining corridors with full military precision. Thunder could shake the very foundations of the palace. The emperor slept on, his breathing deep and even, his face smoothed of the worry lines that creased it during his waking hours. This gift, or curse, had not gone unnoticed by those who moved in the palace's shadows. Chapter 2. The taste of conspiracy. Flavius Aetius controlled the army, but he was 300 miles away, campaigning against Attila's latest incursions along the Rhine. In his absence, the palace filled with men whose ambitions had been long held in check by the general's iron presence. Chief among them was Senator Petronius Maximus, whose family had been accumulating grievances against the Theodosian dynasty for 2 generations. Maximus possessed the particular type of intelligence that flourishes in the hothouse atmosphere of courts. Subtle, patient, and utterly without scruple. He had married wealth, inherited position, and cultivated influence with the methodical precision of a master gardener. His house on the Palatine had become a gathering place for those who whispered that the empire needed stronger leadership, by which they meant leadership more amenable to their interests. I knew of these gatherings not through any grand revelation, but through the accumulation of small observations that comprised the true education of a palace servant. The sudden silence that fell when I entered rooms, the way certain senators no longer met my eyes in the corridors, the increase in private dinners and hunting expeditions, where the same handful of men appeared again and again. Most telling was the change in the quality of the gifts that began arriving at the palace. Where once we had received the usual tribute from provincial governors, amphorae of wine, bolts of silk, decorative weapons, now came items of a more practical nature. A hunting knife from Gaul, its blade sharp enough to split hairs. A selection of wines from a vineyard owned by Maximus's cousin, each bottle sealed with wax that bore no identifying marks. A collection of Persian sleeping herbs, supposedly a remedy for the emperor's condition, delivered by a physician whose credentials could not be verified. The palace eunuchs, those masters of survival who had served emperors for decades, began to move with a new wariness. They spoke in even lower whispers than usual, and seemed always to be glancing over their shoulders. The head cook, a Sicilian named Gaius, who had fed 3 emperors, started tasting every dish twice before it left his kitchens. Yet through all of this gathering tension, Valentinian continued to sleep. His condition, if anything, was worsening. The physicians prescribed bloodletting, cold baths, and dietary restrictions. But nothing seemed to restore the emperor's vitality. He would struggle through morning audiences, his head nodding despite his best efforts, then retreat to his chambers for rest that stretched from noon until the following dawn. It was during one such extended slumber that I made a discovery that should have changed everything. I had entered the imperial chambers to retrieve a document that required the emperor's seal, a routine task that I had performed hundreds of times. The afternoon light filtered through the silk curtains, casting everything in a golden haze. Valentinian lay on his great bed, still fully clothed from the morning's court session, his breathing so deep and regular that for a moment I feared the worst. But his chest rose and fell with the steady rhythm of profound sleep, and his face wore an expression of such peace that it seemed almost sacrilegious to disturb him. The document I sought was not on his usual writing table, so I searched quietly among the scattered papers near his bed. It was there, half hidden beneath a treatise on military engineering, that I found the letter. The papyrus was of Egyptian make, expensive and rare. The script was in a hand I did not recognize, but the contents made my blood run cold. Written in the formal language of senatorial correspondence, it outlined with businesslike precision the benefits that would accrue to the empire under different leadership. It spoke of the need for decisive action and the removal of obstacles to reform. Most damning of all, it bore the seals of 7 senators, including that of Petronius Maximus. My hands trembled as I read, and I was so absorbed in the document's implications that I almost failed to notice the change in the emperor's breathing. But some instinct made me look up, and I found myself staring into Valentinian's open eyes. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The emperor's gaze was clear and alert, so different from the fog that usually clouded his features during his waking hours. He looked at the letter in my hands, then at my face, and I saw something pass across his expression. Not anger, not fear, but a kind of weary resignation. "You have read it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to speak. "And what would you have me do, Marcus Flavius?" "Arrest 7 senators on the word of a treasonous letter that found its way into my private chambers. Execute men whose only crime may be loose talk and wishful thinking." His questions hung in the perfumed air of the chamber like incense smoke. I understood then why he slept so deeply, so often. The weight of such knowledge, such constant calculation of threat and response, would crush a weaker man entirely. "Perhaps," I managed to say, "Your Majesty might take additional precautions, extra guards, food tasters." Valentinian smiled, and in that expression I saw the ghost of the man who had once been called the last of the Romans. "Do you think I have not considered such measures? But what good are guards against men who sup at my table? What protection can food tasters provide against those who would poison the very air of the palace with their ambitions?" He sat up slowly, his joints creaking with the particular stiffness that came from too much sleep and too little rest. "No, my faithful secretary. Sometimes the only defense against conspiracy is to appear so helpless, so unaware that the conspirators grow careless. a sleeping emperor seems less dangerous than a wakeful one. This conversation took place on the 15th day of Maius, 3 weeks before the night that would test the emperor's strategy to its very limits. Chapter 3. The Architecture of Murder. The plot, when it finally crystallized, bore all the hallmarks of Maximus's methodical mind. It was neither crude nor hurried, but rather unfolded with the inexorable logic of a well-constructed legal argument. The conspirators had learned from the failures of previous palace coups, understanding that success required not just the removal of the emperor, but control of the narrative that would follow. They had chosen the night of the Ides of Junius for reasons both practical and symbolic. It would be the anniversary of Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon, a date that resonated with historical significance. More importantly, it was the night of the new moon, when darkness would provide cover for their movements. Aetius would still be campaigning in Gaul, too far away to intervene. The Praetorian Guard would be at minimal strength, with half their number accompanying a diplomatic mission to Constantinople. The plan itself was elegant in its simplicity. A private dinner would be held at Maximus's villa, ostensibly to discuss grain supplies for the coming winter. The emperor, struggling as always with insomnia, would be provided with a specially prepared wine meant to help him sleep. Once unconsciousness was assured, a small group would enter the palace through a servant's entrance, one whose guard had been carefully suborned, and complete their task in the emperor's own chambers. The aftermath had been choreographed with equal care. News of the emperor's sudden demise would be withheld long enough for Maximus to secure the loyalty of key military commanders. A story would be circulated about a long illness finally claiming the emperor's life. The Senate would be convened to choose a successor, and with Aetius absent and no clear heir apparent, Maximus himself would emerge as the natural choice. I learned these details not through any single revelation, but through the accumulation of seemingly innocent information. A conversation overheard in the palace baths about the new moon's auspicious properties. A request from the imperial kitchen for a particular vintage of wine. A notice that certain guards would be given leave on specific dates. A casual mention that the emperor had been invited to dine privately with several senators. The pieces assembled themselves in my mind like the fragments of a broken mosaic, forming a pattern too clear to ignore, yet too terrible to fully comprehend. I found myself in the impossible position of knowing that my emperor was walking toward his doom with the same measured pace he brought to all his duties. 2 days before the planned dinner, I made my decision. I waited until the evening audiences had concluded and the emperor had retired to his private chambers. The palace had settled into its nighttime rhythm. Guards changing shifts with muffled commands, servants padding through corridors on final errands, the distant sound of kitchen slaves cleaning the bronze vessels from the day's meals. Valentinian was sitting by his window, looking out over the marshes that surrounded Ravenna. The setting sun painted the distant waters the color of old blood, and somewhere in the reeds, nightbirds called to their mates with voices like rusty hinges. "Your Majesty," I began, then stopped, uncertain how to proceed. He turned from the window, and I saw that his eyes were clear and alert. "You have something to tell me, Marcus Flavius. I can see it in the way you stand, the way you hesitate. Speak freely." So I told him everything. The letter, my suspicions about the gathering conspiracy, the pattern of small details that pointed toward the coming attempt on his life. I spoke for perhaps an hour, laying out the evidence piece by piece, watching his face for any sign of surprise or alarm. When I finished, Valentinian was quiet for a long time. The sun had set completely, and the chamber was lit only by the flickering flames of oil lamps. Their light danced across his features, making it impossible to read his expression. "You have served me well," he said finally. "Better than I had any right to expect from a man whose only fault was being born into an age of diminished possibilities." He rose from his chair and walked to a cabinet inlaid with ivory and mother of pearl. From it, he withdrew a small bronze key and used it to open a compartment I had never noticed before. Inside were perhaps a dozen scrolls, each tied with silk ribbon. "Letters," he explained, selecting one and unrolling it. "From provincial governors, military commanders, even from Aetius himself, each one warning me of plots, conspiracies, attempts on my life. If I took every such warning seriously, I would never leave this chamber, never eat a meal, never trust another human soul." He re-rolled the scroll and returned it to its hiding place. "But your warning is different, Marcus Flavius. You have served in this palace long enough to distinguish between rumor and reality. If you say that Maximus means to act, then I believe you. Then you will take precautions, cancel the dinner, increase the guard." Valentinian shook his head slowly. "Such actions would only delay the inevitable. Maximus is not a man to be deterred by temporary setbacks. He would simply wait for a better opportunity, and next time we might not receive such clear warning of his intentions." "Then what will you do?" The emperor's smile was sad and knowing. "I will attend his dinner, Marcus Flavius. I will drink his wine and accept his hospitality with every appearance of unsuspecting gratitude. And then I will return to my chambers and sleep more deeply than I have in months." I stared at him, unable to believe what I was hearing. "Your Majesty, they mean to end your life. This is not some political maneuvering or court intrigue. They intend your death." "Yes," he said simply. "I believe they do. But you see, my faithful secretary, they have made one crucial error in their calculations. They believe that a sleeping emperor is a helpless emperor. They have yet to learn that sometimes the deepest sleep can be the most difficult to interrupt." Chapter 4. The Dinner of Fates. The Villa of Petronius. Maximus occupied a hilltop overlooking Ravenna's harbour, its white marble walls gleaming like bone in the afternoon sun. Built in the grand style of the early empire, it boasted courtyards filled with exotic plants, galleries lined with Greek statuary, and reception halls that could accommodate hundreds of guests. On this particular evening, however, the household had been reduced to its essential staff, and only 7 men would share the senator's table. I accompanied the emperor as part of his reduced retinue, along with 2 guards and his personal cupbearer. The journey from the palace took less than an hour, but it felt like a ride to the underworld. Valentinian sat in his litter with his eyes closed, but I could tell from the set of his shoulders that he was not sleeping. His hands, usually so steady, showed the faint tremor that came from tightly controlled nerves. The senator himself greeted us at the villa's entrance, flanked by his 6 co-conspirators. They had dressed for the occasion in their finest togas, the purple stripes of their senatorial rank gleaming against white wool. Their faces bore expressions of carefully crafted respect and concern, but I could see the tension in their postures, the way their eyes flickered to one another when they thought no one was looking. "Your Imperial Majesty," Maximus said, executing a bow that was neither too deep nor too shallow. "You honor my humble house with your presence." Valentinian returned the greeting with perfect courtesy, inquiring after the senator's family and commenting favorably on the villa's gardens. To any casual observer, it would have appeared to be nothing more than a routine social engagement between the emperor and his leading subjects. The dining chamber had been prepared with exquisite care. Low couches surrounded a central table laden with gold and silver vessels. The walls were decorated with frescoes depicting scenes from the Aeneid, and the air was perfumed with roses and myrrh. Musicians played softly in an adjoining room, their melodies designed to encourage conversation and relaxation. As was customary, the meal began with offerings to the household gods and a toast to the emperor's health. The wine served for this initial ceremony was a light vintage from the senator's own vineyards, its taste clean and unremarkable. I watched Valentinian sip from his cup, noting the way he paused to appreciate the wine's bouquet before drinking. The conversation during the first courses was carefully neutral. Discussions of grain imports, reports from various provinces, speculation about the weather's effect on the autumn harvest. The conspirators had clearly rehearsed their roles, each man contributing observations that painted a picture of an empire beset by challenges, but not beyond hope of recovery. It was only when the main course was served that the tone began to shift. Senator Avitus, a man whose family had been prominent since the days of Trajan, raised the subject of military reforms. His suggestions were reasonable on their surface: reorganization of the legions, better pay for soldiers, improved recruitment from the provinces. But underneath lay an implicit criticism of current policies. "The army needs leadership that understands modern warfare," Avitus said, his voice carrying just enough emphasis to make his meaning clear. "Leaders who can inspire loyalty through strength rather than tradition." Other voices joined the discussion, each adding their own subtle criticisms. The emperor was too trusting of barbarian allies, too willing to negotiate when force would be more effective, too focused on preserving old forms when innovation was required. Through it all, Valentinian listened with the patient attention of a teacher allowing students to present their arguments. He asked occasional questions, sought clarification on specific points, and nodded thoughtfully at suggestions that had merit. To the conspirators, he must have appeared exactly as they hoped: a tired old man, overwhelmed by the complexities of rule, perhaps even grateful for their guidance. As the evening progressed, I began to notice changes in the emperor's behavior that the others seemed to miss. His responses became slightly slower, his words more carefully chosen. His eyelids grew heavy, and he began to blink more frequently. When servants refilled his wine cup, and I noticed that it was refilled often, always from a particular amphora, he drank without his usual careful consideration of the vintage. By the time the final course was served, Valentinian was struggling to keep his head upright. His chin would drop toward his chest, then jerk back up as he fought against the growing lethargy. His words began to slur slightly, and his hands moved with the careful deliberation of a man trying to conceal his condition. "Perhaps," suggested Maximus with perfectly feigned concern, His Majesty would benefit from an early return to the palace. The evening air might provide some relief from this unusual fatigue. Valentinian nodded slowly, his movements sluggish. "Yes," he said, his voice thick. "Yes, I believe you are right. The day has been unusually trying." The senator immediately offered his own litter for the emperor's transport, along with an escort of his personal guards. Such generosity was declined with sleepy gratitude, and arrangements were made for the imperial party to return to the palace, as originally planned. As we prepared to leave, I caught sight of the expressions on the conspirators' faces. Where before there had been tension and carefully controlled excitement, now there was only grim satisfaction. They had seen their carefully administered dose take effect exactly as planned. The emperor would return to his chambers, sink into unconsciousness, and never wake again. But as I helped Valentinian into his litter, he turned his head toward me with a movement that was neither sluggish nor uncontrolled. For just a moment, his eyes were completely clear, and he gave me the slightest of nods. The return journey to the palace passed in a haze of gathering darkness and mounting dread. Valentinian appeared to be sleeping deeply, his breathing regular and his body completely relaxed. But I had seen that flash of clarity in his eyes, and I knew that whatever the conspirators believed they had accomplished, the night was far from over. Chapter 5. The Weight of Darkness. The palace after midnight possessed a quality of silence that is almost tangible. It pressed against the ears like deep water, broken only by the measured tread of guards making their rounds and the distant sound of the harbour bells marking the passage of hours. In the emperor's chambers, that silence took on an even more profound character, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Valentinian had been carried to his bed by his personal servants, men who had tended him for years and knew every aspect of his nightly routine. They removed his formal robes, replacing them with a simple sleeping tunic of Egyptian cotton. They arranged his limbs in the position he preferred for rest, placed a light coverlet over his body, and ensured that fresh water and a lamp were within reach should he wake during the night. To all appearances, the emperor slept with the profound unconsciousness of a man whose wine had been carefully doctored with poppy extract and other sedating herbs. His breathing was deep and regular, his face peaceful, his body utterly still. Even the most careful observer would have concluded that nothing short of the collapse of the palace itself could rouse him before dawn. I had positioned myself in the small antechamber that connected the emperor's sleeping quarters to the main corridor. Officially, I was there to handle any urgent correspondence that might arrive during the night, a duty that fell to senior secretaries perhaps once or twice a year. In reality, I was there because I could not bear to leave the emperor unguarded, and because some instinct told me that the night's events were far from concluded. The first hint that something was amiss came shortly after the second hour past midnight. I became aware of a change in the palace's normal sounds, not the addition of anything new, but rather the absence of familiar noises. The regular patrol of guards through the corridor outside had fallen silent. The murmur of voices from the kitchen staff, who normally worked through the night preparing bread for the morning, had ceased. Even the mice that usually scurried through the walls seemed to have found other business. This unnatural quiet was broken by the softest possible sound, the whisper of sandaled feet on marble floors. The steps came from the direction of the servants' staircase, moving with the careful precision of men who knew exactly where they were going and were determined to arrive undetected. Through the narrow gap where the antechamber door met its frame, I could see a sliver of the main corridor. Shadows moved across this space, darker patches against the dim glow of the oil lamps that burned throughout the night. The shadows were man-shaped, but they moved with a strange, halting rhythm, as if their owners were pausing frequently to listen. My mouth went dry, and I felt the familiar sensation of fear spreading outward from my stomach like spilled wine. These were not servants going about their duties, nor guards making their rounds. These were intruders moving through the imperial palace with deadly purpose. The shadows paused just outside the antechamber, and I heard the faintest whisper of voices. The words were too quiet to distinguish, but the tone was urgent and questioning. Someone was giving final instructions, making last-minute adjustments to their plan. Then the door to the Emperor's chambers opened with a soft click of bronze hinges, and the shadows disappeared inside. For a moment that seemed to stretch like molten glass, I remained frozen in my hiding place. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to find guards, to raise an alarm that would bring the entire palace running. But I also knew that by the time help arrived, whatever the intruders intended would be accomplished. The Emperor, whether truly sleeping or merely appearing so, was alone with men who had come to end his life. Moving as quietly as I could manage, I crept to the connecting door and pressed my ear against the wood. The sounds that reached me were almost too soft to detect. The rustle of fabric, the creak of floorboards, the careful breathing of men moving through a darkened room. Then came a sound that made my blood freeze, a metallic whisper that could only be a blade being drawn from its sheath. What followed was perhaps the strangest sequence of events I have witnessed in a lifetime spent observing the peculiarities of imperial power. The intruders had clearly expected to find the Emperor in the grip of drugged unconsciousness, easy prey for whatever method of dispatch they had chosen. Instead, they found themselves faced with a man whose sleep seemed almost supernatural in its depth. As I later learned from witnesses, their first attempts to rouse him, gentle shaking, whispered words, even the press of cold bronze against his throat, produced no response whatsoever. The Emperor's breathing continued its steady rhythm. His face remained peaceful and relaxed. His body showed no tension, no awareness of danger. To the conspirators, it must have seemed as if they were dealing not with a living man, but with some enchanted figure from the old stories, a sleeper so deeply lost in dreams that the boundary between consciousness and death had become meaningless. What I heard through the door was a series of increasingly frantic whispers, punctuated by longer periods of silence. The intruders were clearly struggling with a situation they had not anticipated. Their carefully laid plans had accounted for many contingencies, but not for a victim who seemed incapable of awakening even under the most extreme circumstances. As the minutes passed, I began to understand what was happening. The poppy extract and other drugs that had been administered to the Emperor had indeed taken effect, but not in the way the conspirators intended. Instead of rendering him helpless, they had plunged him into a sleep so profound that his body's normal responses to external stimuli had been completely suppressed. The intruders faced a terrible choice: They could proceed with their original plan, completing their task while the emperor remained unconscious. But such an approach would rob them of the satisfaction they had anticipated, the moment of recognition in their victim's eyes, the acknowledgement of defeat that would validate their victory. Alternatively, they could attempt to wake him, to force him into awareness of his fate. But every moment they spent in the chamber increased the risk of discovery. The palace might seem empty of guards, but a few had undoubtedly remained at their posts, and the absence of the regular patrols would eventually be noticed. Through the door, I heard one of the intruders hiss a curse in the dialect of the Roman streets. Another voice whispered urgently about the passing of time. A third suggested that they abandon their mission and return when conditions were more favorable. But even as they debated, another sound reached my ears, one that chilled me more than all the whispered threats and drawn blades that had preceded it. From the emperor's bed came a new sound of breathing, deeper and more resonant than before. And threading through it, barely audible but unmistakable to anyone who had spent years in the imperial presence, was the soft rumble of a snore. Chapter 6. The Sound That Saved an Empire. There are moments in history when the fate of nations turns on the smallest of hinges. Battles have been won by the flight of birds that confused enemy scouts. Dynasties have fallen because a horse stumbled at the wrong moment. Empires have endured because their rulers possessed some unexpected quality that their enemies had failed to account for. The sound of Valentinian's snoring filled the chamber like a living thing. It was not the gentle breathing of ordinary sleep, nor even the heavy exhalations of a man in the grip of wine. This was something altogether more profound, a resonant, rhythmic rumble that seemed to emerge from the very depths of his being. To the conspirators, frozen in the darkness with weapons in their hands, this sound must have been like a voice from the underworld. They had come prepared to face a man, whether awake or sleeping. They had not come prepared to deal with someone who seemed to exist in a realm beyond normal human consciousness. Through the door, I could hear their growing agitation. Whispered conferences became more urgent. Someone stumbled in the darkness, causing a small table to scrape against the floor. Another voice hissed a warning about the need for silence, only to be answered by a third voice pointing out that their victim seemed beyond the reach of any earthly noise. As if to prove this point, the emperor's snoring grew even louder. The sound filled the chamber and spilled out into the antechamber where I crouched, listening with a mixture of terror and fascination. It was as if Valentinian's sleeping mind had decided to assert its presence in the most impossible way, not through awakening and resistance, but through an exhibition of slumber so complete that it rendered all threat meaningless. The intruders made several more attempts to rouse him. I heard the sound of hands clapping near his face, the scrape of bronze against bronze as weapons were brandished close to his head, even what sounded like water being splashed on his skin. Through it all, the emperor slept on, his breathing deep and untroubled, his snoring maintaining its steady, almost hypnotic rhythm. It was then that I heard something that, even now, 30 years later, I can barely credit. One of the conspirators began to laugh. It started as a barely suppressed snicker, the kind of sound that escapes when nervous tension meets absurdity. But it grew, fed by the impossible nature of their situation, until it became genuine, uncontrolled laughter. The man, and I believe it was Senator Avitus, though I could never prove this, found himself overcome by the sheer ridiculousness of their predicament. Here they were, the most powerful men in the empire after the emperor himself, armed with the finest weapons money could buy, backed by carefully laid plans and positioned to reshape the history of Rome. And they were being defeated by the simple sound of an old man's snoring. The laughter was contagious. Despite the mortal danger of their situation, despite the months of planning and the weight of their ambitions, the other conspirators found themselves succumbing to the same hysteria. Soon the chamber echoed with barely suppressed mirth, punctuated by frantic attempts to restore order and quiet. This was the moment when their enterprise truly collapsed. The combination of unexpected circumstance, mounting tension, and the fundamental absurdity of their situation had destroyed their resolve as surely as any military defeat. They were no longer assassins engaged in a crucial political action, but rather a group of middle-aged senators trying not to laugh at their own incompetence. The emperor, oblivious to this transformation, continued to sleep. His snoring had settled into a rhythm that seemed almost musical, rising and falling like some ancient hymn to the gods of slumber. If anything, the sound seemed to be growing more pronounced, as if his unconscious mind had decided to make itself heard throughout the entire palace. Through my listening post at the door, I could follow the conspirators' final moments in the chamber. Their whispered conferences took on a note of desperation as they realized that their opportunity was slipping away. Dawn was still hours distant, but already they could hear signs that the palace's normal routine was beginning to reassert itself. Kitchen slaves were stirring in the lower levels, and somewhere in the distance, a guard was calling the third watch. One voice, I believe it was Maximus himself, made a final argument for proceeding with their original plan despite the circumstances. But he was overruled by the others, who seemed to understand that whatever power they might have wielded as deliberate agents of change had been completely undermined by the night's events. They were no longer making history. They were fleeing from a situation that had become too absurd to sustain. The sound of their departure was as careful and quiet as their arrival had been. Weapons were sheathed, positions abandoned, and the chamber gradually emptied of all presence except for the sleeping emperor and his magnificent snoring. I remained in my hiding place for another hour, listening to the return of normal palace sounds. The guard patrols resumed their regular routes. The kitchen staff began their preparations for the morning meal. Somewhere in the eastern wing, a chamberlain was already moving through his early duties. And through it all, Valentinian slept on, his breathing deep and peaceful, his snoring a testament to the strange ways in which Providence sometimes chooses to preserve the lives of rulers. Chapter 7. The morning after history. Dawn came to Ravenna like a cautious servant, slipping through windows and around curtains with apologetic gentleness. The light that eventually filled the emperor's chamber was soft and golden, carrying with it the familiar sense of the marsh. Salt water, growing reeds, and the indefinable smell of a world awakening from sleep. I had dozed fitfully in the antechamber, starting awake at every sound, unable to fully believe that the night's dangers had passed. When the first birds began calling from the palace gardens, I finally allowed myself to accept that we had survived until morning. The emperor still slept, his breathing now normal and quiet, his face peaceful in the growing light. The first servants to arrive were the slaves who tended the imperial chambers each morning. Elderly men who had performed these duties for decades and knew better than to disturb their master's rest. They moved about their tasks with practiced silence, emptying chamber pots, refreshing the water in bronze basins, and ensuring that fresh clothing was laid out for when the emperor chose to wake. It was Marcus Antonius, the chief chamberlain, who first noticed that something had changed in the night's atmosphere. He was a man whose survival depended on reading the subtle signs of palace life, and as he entered the emperor's chambers for the morning ritual, his experienced eyes immediately detected disturbances that others would have missed. A chair had been moved slightly from its usual position. One of the wall hangings hung at an angle that suggested it had been brushed against. Most telling of all, there was a faint scent in the air. Not perfume or incense, but the particular odor that men carry when they have been sweating with fear. Marcus Antonius approached the emperor's bed with the careful steps of a hunter tracking dangerous prey. Valentinian lay exactly as his servants had positioned him the night before, but the chamberlain's trained eye noted details that spoke of visitation. The coverlet had been disturbed in a pattern that suggested someone had leaned over the sleeping figure. The small table beside the bed showed scratches in its bronze surface, as if metal had been placed there hastily. "Your Majesty," the chamberlain said softly, his voice carrying just enough volume to penetrate normal sleep without jarring a man awake. There was no response. Valentinian's breathing continued with the deep rhythm of profound rest, and his face showed no sign of awareness. Marcus Antonius tried again, this time allowing concern to color his tone. "Your Majesty, the morning audiences await your pleasure." Still nothing. The emperor slept with the complete absence of consciousness that had characterized his rest for the past several months. But now the chamberlain began to wonder if this sleep might be more than natural weariness. It was then that I emerged from my hiding place in the antechamber, knowing that my continued concealment would only raise more questions than it answered. Marcus Antonius spun toward me with the reflexes of a man accustomed to palace intrigue, his hand moving instinctively toward the ceremonial dagger at his belt. "Secretary Severus," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "you are abroad early this morning." "I could not sleep," I replied, which was perfectly true. "I thought to complete some correspondence while the palace was quiet." The chamberlain's eyes studied my face with the intensity of a scholar examining a difficult text. He had not achieved his position by accepting simple explanations when complex ones might be more accurate. "Indeed," he said, "and has your work been productive?" Before I could answer, a new sound came from the emperor's bed, not the deep breathing of sleep, but a softer exhalation that suggested a change in consciousness. Both Marcus Antonius and I turned toward the sound, and we saw Valentinian's eyelids flutter briefly before opening. The emperor's gaze was clear and alert, showing none of the confusion that usually accompanied his awakening from deep sleep. He looked first at the chamberlain, then at me, and I saw in his expression the same calculated awareness that had characterized our conversation before the fateful dinner. "Good morning, Marcus Antonius," he said, his voice steady and strong. "I trust the palace survived the night without incident." The chamberlain's relief was visible, though he tried to conceal it behind his professional demeanor. "The night passed quietly, Your Majesty, though I confess there were irregularities in the guard rotations that will require investigation. Valentinian sat up slowly, swinging his legs over the side of the bed, with movements that showed no trace of the lethargy that had plagued him in recent weeks. Irregularities, he repeated thoughtfully. Yes, I imagine there were. And I suppose our friend Severus here has been conducting his own investigation into these matters. All eyes turned to me, and I found myself at the center of attention in a way that palace secretaries are trained from birth to avoid. The weight of what I had witnessed pressed against my chest like a stone, but I also understood that my next words might determine not only my own fate, but the future stability of the empire. Your Majesty, I began carefully, I believe there are matters of state security that require your immediate attention. Valentinian nodded, as if this was exactly what he had expected to hear. Then perhaps you should summon Senator Maximus and his colleagues for an audience this afternoon. I find myself curious about their opinions on recent developments. Marcus Antonius and I exchanged glances, both of us understanding that we were witnessing the Emperor's first moves in a game whose rules only he fully comprehended. Chapter 8. The Summons. The message that went out to Senator Petronius Maximus and his associates was a masterpiece of imperial courtesy. Written in the formal language of court protocol, it requested their presence at an afternoon audience to discuss matters of mutual interest to the empire's future. The tone was neither threatening nor suspicious, but rather carried the slightly weary politeness of a ruler seeking counsel from his most trusted advisors. I was present when the imperial messengers departed, and I watched their progress from an upper window as they made their way through Ravenna's narrow streets toward the residential quarter where the great senatorial houses stood. The morning sun cast their shadows long across the paving stones, and somewhere in the distance, church bells were calling the faithful to their daily devotions. The hours that followed were among the strangest in my experience of palace life. Valentinian conducted his morning audiences with a vigor and attention to detail that had been absent for months. He listened to petitions with genuine interest, asked probing questions about administrative matters, and made decisions with the swift confidence of a man whose mind was completely clear. Yet underneath this apparent normalcy, the entire palace hummed with suppressed tension. Word of the night's irregularities had begun to circulate among the staff, though in the distorted way of all palace gossip. Some whispered that the emperor had been visited by prophetic dreams. Others suggested that foreign agents had been discovered in the corridors. A few even claimed that the ghost of Julius Caesar had walked the halls, warning of treachery. Marcus Antonius had conducted his promised investigation into the guard rotations with characteristic thoroughness. What he discovered painted a picture of carefully orchestrated negligence. Key sentries had been reassigned at the last moment. Others had been provided with wine that contained enough poppy extract to ensure their drowsiness. Most damaging of all, the servants' entrance through which the conspirators had gained access showed clear signs of recent use, including traces of mud that matched soil from the path leading to Maximus's villa. When the appointed hour arrived, the 7 senators appeared at the palace, with every appearance of men responding to a routine imperial summons. They wore their finest togas and carried themselves with the dignified bearing appropriate to their rank. If any of them felt anxiety about the previous night's failure, They concealed it behind masks of senatorial composure. The audience chamber where Valentinian received them was one of the palace's most impressive spaces. Marble columns supported a coffered ceiling decorated with scenes from Roman military history. The floor was paved with mosaics depicting the defeat of various barbarian tribes, and the walls were lined with statues of deified emperors. At the far end, the imperial throne sat on a raised dais, flanked by braziers that filled the air with the scent of sandalwood. I positioned myself among the cluster of secretaries and minor officials who attended such formal occasions, my stylus ready to record whatever transpired. From this vantage point, I could observe both the emperor's face and the expressions of the men who had come so close to ending his life. Valentinian entered the chamber with measured steps, his purple robes rustling against the marble floor. He had chosen to wear the full regalia of imperial authority, the golden diadem, the jeweled fibulae, the ceremonial sword that symbolized his role as supreme commander of Rome's armies. But what struck me most forcefully was not the magnificence of his appearance, but the quality of alertness in his eyes. "My friends," he began, his voice carrying easily through the vaulted space, "I have asked you here to discuss certain matters that have come to my attention. Matters that touch upon the security of our empire and the loyalty of those who serve it." The senators arranged themselves in a semicircle before the throne, their faces showing nothing more than polite attention. But I noticed how Maximus's hands remained perfectly still at his sides, and how Senator Avitus avoided direct eye contact with the emperor. "It has been brought to my notice," Valentinian continued, "that there are those among our citizens who believe the empire would benefit from different leadership. Men who feel that the challenges we face require a more vigorous approach to governance." A murmur of interest ran through the assembled courtiers, but the 7 senators remained silent. They had clearly decided that their best strategy was to offer no information that might incriminate them. "Such concerns are not unreasonable," the emperor said, his tone remaining conversational. "Indeed, I have often wondered myself whether a younger man, or perhaps one with different experience, might not serve Rome more effectively than one who has grown weary from the burdens of rule." This was not what anyone had expected to hear. Several of the courtiers exchanged glances of surprise, and even Marcus Antonius looked uncertain about where the emperor's words were leading. "But then," Valentinian continued, "I am reminded that leadership is not merely a matter of energy or ambition. It is also a question of understanding. Understanding the complex web of loyalties and betrayals that bind an empire together. Understanding the patience required to let events unfold in their proper time. Understanding the difference between strength and mere violence." He paused, allowing his gaze to rest on each of the senators in turn. When his eyes met those of Petronius Maximus, I saw something pass between them, a communication that transcended words. "Last night," the emperor said, "I had the most remarkable dream." The quality of silence in the chamber changed, becoming denser and more expectant. Even the servants who tended the braziers seemed to hold their breath. "I dreamed that I was visited by figures from our glorious past, senators and generals who had served Rome in her greatest hours. They spoke to me of loyalty and duty, of the sacred trust that binds ruler and subject. But most interesting of all, they warned me of those who would mistake weakness for opportunity. Valentinian rose from his throne, descending the steps of the dais with the measured pace of a man delivering a judgment. In my dream, these ancient spirits told me that such men would reveal themselves through their actions, that they would expose their intentions as clearly as if they had written them in letters of fire across the sky. And they promised me that when such revelation came, I would possess the wisdom to respond appropriately. He had reached the bottom of the steps now, standing on the same level as the senators. Despite their numerical advantage, despite their wealth and influence, they seemed to shrink before his presence. "Do you believe in the truth of dreams, Senator Maximus?" Valentinian asked, his voice soft, but carrying clearly through the chamber. Maximus cleared his throat before responding. "Your Majesty, I believe that the gods speak to men in many ways, and that wise rulers listen carefully to all forms of counsel." "Indeed," the emperor said. "And what counsel would you offer to a ruler who had learned, through whatever means, that certain of his subjects had forgotten the nature of their duties?" The trap was beautifully constructed and perfectly sprung. Maximus could not claim ignorance without appearing foolish, nor could he admit knowledge without confessing his involvement. He chose instead to speak in generalities. "I would suggest, Your Majesty, that such subjects might benefit from a reminder of the rewards that come to those who serve faithfully, and the consequences that await those who do not." Valentinian smiled, and in that expression I saw something that reminded me why he was called the last of the Romans. "Excellent advice, Senator, and I believe I shall take it." Chapter 9. The Art of Imperial Mercy. What followed was not the dramatic confrontation that Greek tragedies would lead one to expect. There were no thunderous accusations, no guards rushing forward with drawn swords, no senators pleading for their lives or confessing their crimes. Instead, Valentinian demonstrated the more subtle art of political theatre that had sustained the Roman Empire through 4 centuries of internal strife. "I have decided," the emperor announced, "to reorganize certain aspects of our administrative structure. The empire's security requires that trusted men be placed in positions where their loyalty and experience can be most effectively utilized." He began to pace slowly before the assembled senators, his hands clasped behind his back, in the gesture that courtiers had learned to recognize as a sign of deep thought. "Senator Maximus, your family's long service to Rome suggests that you would be ideally suited for an important diplomatic mission. The King of the Vandals has expressed interest in renegotiating our treaty regarding tribute from North Africa. I believe your skills would be invaluable in such negotiations." The offer was presented with perfect courtesy, but everyone in the chamber understood its true nature. North Africa was a posting that would remove Maximus from the center of power for months, possibly years. More importantly, it would place him in a region where imperial agents could monitor his every action. "Your Majesty honors me beyond my deserving," Maximus replied, his voice carefully controlled. "When would you require my departure?" "Soon," Valentinian said. "Very soon. In fact, I believe it would be best if you could begin preparations immediately. The diplomatic situation is delicate." Similar fates awaited the other conspirators. Senator Avitus found himself appointed to oversee grain distribution in Sardinia. 2 others were assigned to tax collection duties in remote Gallic provinces. Each appointment was presented as a mark of imperial favor, but each also served to scatter the conspirators across the empire and place them under the supervision of officials whose loyalty was unquestioned. Only 3 of the 7 senators were to remain in Ravenna, and these were men whom the investigation had shown to be peripheral figures in the conspiracy, followers rather than leaders, motivated more by fear of exclusion than by genuine ambition. As for the remaining administrative changes, Valentinian continued, I have decided to create a new position within the palace hierarchy. The post of Secretary for Internal Security will be responsible for monitoring the loyalty of all imperial servants and ensuring that our domestic affairs remain free from irregularities. His gaze found me among the crowd of minor officials, and I felt the weight of imperial attention settle on my shoulders like a heavy cloak. Marcus Flavius Severus has demonstrated both the intelligence and the discretion required for such responsibilities. I am confident that under his supervision, we will experience no further disruptions to the normal conduct of palace business. The promotion was as unexpected as it was unwelcome. I had spent 12 years learning to be invisible, to observe without being observed, to serve without attracting attention. Now I found myself thrust into a position that would make me one of the most watched men in the empire, trusted by the emperor, but inevitably suspected by everyone else. The audience concluded with the usual formalities, but the atmosphere had been fundamentally transformed. Where before there had been the comfortable predictability of established routine, now there was the electric tension that comes when power relationships shift suddenly and permanently. As the senators filed out of the chamber, I noticed how they avoided each other's eyes. The conspiracy that had bound them together had been destroyed not by force or dramatic revelation, but by the simple expedient of separating them and giving each man reason to fear that his colleagues might betray him to curry favor with the emperor. When the chamber had emptied of all but the essential staff, Valentinian beckoned me to approach the throne. The weight of my new responsibilities was already settling on my mind like a fog, bringing with it questions I had no idea how to answer. You look troubled, Marcus Flavius, the emperor observed. Are you not pleased with your advancement? Your Majesty, I am honored by your confidence, but I confess I am uncertain about my qualifications for such duties. I am a secretary, not a man of action. Valentinian's smile was tired but genuine. Do you think last night required action? What it required was observation, patience, and the wisdom to know when not to act. These are qualities that cannot be taught to men who lack them, but they can be refined in those who possess them naturally. He rose from the throne and walked to one of the chamber's great windows, gazing out over the city that had become the last capital of the Western Empire. You asked me once why I slept so deeply, so often. I told you it was strategy, but that was only part of the truth. The complete answer is that sleep is the only place where an emperor can find peace. In dreams, the weight of empire disappears. In sleep, the constant calculations of threat and response fall silent. In unconsciousness, even a ruler can know what it means to be simply human. He turned back toward me, and I saw in his face the accumulated weariness of 7 years on the throne. But last night taught me something new about the nature of sleep. It can be not just an escape from power, but a form of power itself. The men who came to end my life expected to find weakness in my unconsciousness. Instead, They discovered that some forms of strength are too deep to be easily reached. And now, Your Majesty, what becomes of the empire, of your rule? Valentinian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze returning to the window and the city beyond. Now we continue, Marcus Flavius. We rule as we have always ruled, day by day, decision by decision, always walking the narrow line between strength and tyranny, between trust and suspicion. The conspiracy is ended, but the conditions that created it remain. There will be other plots, other ambitious men, other nights when the fate of empire hangs on smaller hinges than anyone might imagine. He paused, then added with something that might have been humor. But perhaps I will sleep a little less deeply in the nights to come. Chapter 10. The Weight of Secrets. The months that followed the failed conspiracy brought changes to the palace that were subtle but profound. On the surface, life continued much as it always had. The same daily routines of audiences and administrative work. The same complex dance of courtiers seeking favor. The same steady stream of reports from provinces throughout the empire. But underneath this apparent normalcy, new currents flowed. My elevation to Secretary for Internal Security had created ripples that I was still learning to navigate. The position came with its own staff, a collection of clerks, messengers, and agents whose previous loyalties were as varied as their backgrounds. Some were seasoned palace servants who understood the unspoken rules of imperial service. Others were newer arrivals, recruited from the military or from civilian posts throughout the empire. All of them looked to me for guidance in matters I was still learning to understand myself. The office assigned to my new duties occupied a suite of rooms in the palace's eastern wing, positioned to provide easy access to both the emperor's private chambers and the main administrative areas. The walls were lined with cabinets containing files on every significant figure in the imperial hierarchy. Senators, generals, provincial governors, and wealthy merchants whose business dealings touched on matters of state security. Reading through these documents was like exploring a vast underground city. Each file revealed networks of relationship and obligation that stretched across the empire's remaining territories. Family connections dating back generations intertwined with recent business partnerships. Military loyalties crossed paths with religious affiliations. Political alliances shifted like shadows as circumstances changed and opportunities emerged. The conspiracy involving Maximus had left traces throughout this documentary maze. Letters referenced obliquely in other correspondence began to make sense when viewed in the context of the plot. Financial transactions that had seemed routine revealed themselves as payments for services rendered in the service of treason. Travel records showed patterns of movement that correlated suspiciously with the conspiracy's timeline. But perhaps most disturbing were the connections that extended beyond the 7 men who had been directly involved. The investigation revealed a broader network of discontent that reached into every level of imperial society. Merchants complained about tax policies that favored barbarian allies over Roman citizens. Military officers grumbled about recruitment policies that seemed to value political reliability over combat effectiveness. Even within the church hierarchy, there were voices questioning whether an empire that could no longer defend its own borders deserved the loyalty of Christian souls. None of this constituted treason in any legal sense, but it painted a picture of an empire whose foundations were more fragile than its surviving territories might suggest. The conspiracy had been defeated, but the conditions that had made it possible remained largely unchanged. Valentinian seemed to understand this as clearly as I did. In our weekly meetings, he listened with patient attention as I reported on the various undercurrents of dissatisfaction that my investigations had uncovered. But his responses were measured and pragmatic rather than reactive. An empire that tried to silence every voice of criticism would quickly find itself ruling over a desert, he observed during one such session. The art lies in distinguishing between legitimate complaint and genuine threat, between words spoken in frustration and plans made in earnest. And how does one make such distinctions, Your Majesty? His smile was weary, but not without humour. Experience, Marcus Flavius, and a willingness to accept that sometimes one will guess wrong. The price of ruling is that every decision carries the risk of catastrophic error, but the price of not deciding is even higher. These conversations took place in the Emperor's private study, a chamber whose windows looked out over the palace gardens. The room was furnished simply: a desk of dark oak, several chairs upholstered in leather, shelves lined with the works of classical authors. On the walls hung portraits of previous emperors, their painted eyes seeming to observe our discussions with expressions of approval or disapproval. It was in this room that I came to understand something about the true nature of imperial power. The conspiracy had been defeated not through dramatic action or overwhelming force, but through the patient application of knowledge and timing. Valentinian had known of the plot almost from its inception, but he had chosen to let it develop until its adherents revealed themselves completely. Only then had he acted, and his actions had been surgical in their precision. You allowed them to come very close to success, I observed during one of our meetings. Were you not afraid that something might go wrong, that the drugs might not work as expected, that they might proceed despite their difficulties? Valentinian was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming softly against the oak surface of his desk. Fear, he said finally, is a luxury that emperors cannot afford, not because we are braver than other men, but because the cost of being ruled by fear is too high. If I had acted too early, based on suspicion rather than certainty, I would have created martyrs and driven the conspiracy underground. If I had increased security in obvious ways, I would have announced my knowledge and given them time to adapt their plans. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, gazing out at the gardens where autumn was beginning to paint the leaves in shades of gold and crimson. The sleep that nearly killed me also saved me, he continued, because they saw weakness where there was actually a different kind of strength. They expected to find a helpless victim and instead encountered something they had no plan to address. And if they had simply proceeded despite your condition, if they had been less concerned with your awareness of their actions, then I would be dead, and you would be serving a different emperor, he said matter-of-factly. The Game of Thrones is not won by eliminating all risk, but by calculating probabilities and accepting the consequences of one's choices. As winter approached, reports began arriving from the various provinces where the surviving conspirators had been dispatched. Maximus was proving surprisingly effective in his negotiations with the Vandal king, his political skills translating well to diplomatic service. Senator Avitus had organized grain distribution in Sardinia with remarkable efficiency, earning praise from local officials who who had previously complained about corruption and incompetence. "It seems," I reported to the emperor, "that your punishment has proved beneficial both to the empire and to the men being punished." Valentinian nodded thoughtfully. "The best political solutions are those that serve multiple purposes. By removing them from the center of power, we eliminated the immediate threat they represented. By giving them meaningful work to do, we provided them with an alternative to continued plotting. And by demonstrating that loyalty is rewarded while treachery is exiled rather than executed, we sent a message to others who might be considering similar enterprises. And if they attempt to organize resistance from their new positions, then we will deal with that problem when it arises. But I suspect they will not. Men who conspire in palaces often lose their taste for intrigue when confronted with the practical challenges of governing distant provinces. Reality has a way of tempering ambition." Chapter 11. The Long Echo. Spring returned to Ravenna with its familiar promise of renewal, but the events of the previous year had left marks that would not easily fade. The palace functioned smoothly under its new arrangements, but there was a quality of watchfulness that had not existed before. Servants moved with heightened awareness of their surroundings. Courtiers measured their words more carefully in public spaces. Even the guards seemed more alert, their eyes scanning crowds and corridors with practiced attention. My own role in this transformation was both central and largely invisible. The network of informants and agents that had been established to monitor potential threats operated with discretion that would have impressed the most skilled actors. Reports flowed in from across the empire, carried by merchants and pilgrims, soldiers and scholars, all of whom had been recruited to observe and remember without seeming to do so. The information they provided painted a complex picture of an empire adapting to changed circumstances. In Gaul, Aetius continued his campaigns against various barbarian incursions, but his dispatches spoke increasingly of negotiation and alliance rather than conquest and subjugation. In Africa, the diplomatic mission led by Maximus had achieved a new treaty that secured grain shipments in exchange for reduced tribute payments. In Britain, the withdrawal of regular legions was proceeding in an orderly fashion, with local authorities assuming responsibility for their own defense. Each of these developments represented both opportunity and risk. Reduced military commitments freed resources for other uses, but they also acknowledged the empire's inability to maintain its traditional boundaries. Diplomatic agreements with former enemies created stability, but they also legitimized barbarian power in ways that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Valentinian absorbed these reports with the same patient attention he brought to all aspects of governance, but I began to notice changes in his demeanor that suggested the events of the previous year had affected him more deeply than he admitted. His periods of deep sleep became less frequent, and when he did rest, it was with the lighter unconsciousness of a man whose mind never fully relaxed its vigilance. "Do you regret the loss of your profound slumber?" I asked during one of our regular meetings. The emperor considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "I regret the loss of peace that such sleep represented," he said finally, "but I do not regret the awareness that has replaced it. There is something to be said for understanding the true nature of one's situation, even when that understanding brings discomfort." The conversation took place in early summer, as reports arrived of Attila's death in distant Pannonia. The news had spread across the empire like wildfire, carried by traders and travelers who understood its significance even if they could not predict its consequences. The Hun king's passing would create opportunities for some and catastrophes for others. But for the moment, it represented one less immediate threat to imperial security. His death changes the balance of power along our northern borders, I observed. The Hun Confederation will likely fragment without his leadership. Undoubtedly, Valentinian agreed, but fragmentation brings its own problems. Instead of one enemy whose intentions we could predict, we will now face dozens of smaller groups whose actions will be less coordinated, but also less predictable. This proved prophetic. Throughout the remainder of that year, reports filtered in of conflicts among various Hun factions, each struggling to claim portions of Attila's legacy. Some groups moved westward, seeking new territories to raid or settle. Others turned southward, threatening the empire's Danubian provinces. Still others simply dissolved, their members scattering to find service with other barbarian leaders or to establish themselves as independent warlords. Each of these developments required careful evaluation and appropriate response. Diplomatic missions were dispatched to negotiate with leaders who seemed amenable to peaceful relations. Military forces were repositioned to defend against groups that appeared more hostile. Intelligence networks were expanded to provide early warning of significant movements or alliances. The administrative burden of managing these responses fell primarily on men like myself, officials whose names would never appear in historical chronicles, but whose daily decisions shaped the empire's fate as surely as any imperial decree. We worked in chambers filled with maps and documents, tracking the movements of peoples and armies across distances that took months to traverse. We calculated the costs of various policy options, weighing immediate security against long-term stability, military effectiveness against diplomatic opportunity. But perhaps the most significant change in imperial policy was one that emerged not from any single decision, but from the gradual accumulation of small adaptations. The empire was learning to survive through flexibility rather than strength, through accommodation rather than domination. It was a transformation that would have horrified earlier generations of Romans, but it was also the only path that offered any hope of continued existence. Valentinian understood this evolution better than anyone. In our private conversations, he spoke with increasing frankness about the empire's limitations and the need to find new ways of exercising power. Rome once ruled because she could destroy any enemy who challenged her, he observed during one such discussion. Now we must rule by making ourselves useful to allies who might otherwise become enemies. It is a more complex form of statecraft, but perhaps also a more sustainable one. And if this approach fails, if our allies decide they no longer need us, his smile was sad, but not without hope. Then we will adapt again, Marcus Flavius. That is what empires do. They change or they die. We have chosen to change. As the year drew toward its close, I found myself thinking often about the night when imperial fate had hung on the thread of a sleeping emperor's breath. The conspiracy had been defeated, but its defeat had taught lessons that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. It had shown that survival sometimes required the appearance of weakness. That strength could be found in unexpected places. that the art of ruling in a declining age was fundamentally different from the art of ruling in an age of expansion. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that history turns on smaller hinges than most people imagine. The empire had been preserved not by great battles or sweeping reforms, but by one man's ability to sleep so deeply that his would-be assassins lost their nerve. It was a reminder that the grand narratives of rise and fall often obscure the smaller human moments that actually determine the course of events. Epilogue: The memory of sleep. I write these words in the 31st year since that night, in a world that bears little resemblance to the one I served as a young secretary. The Western Empire exists now only in memory and in the claims of barbarian kings who style themselves as Rome's heirs. Ravenna has changed hands multiple times, its palaces occupied by Ostrogothic courts that maintain the forms of Roman administration while serving entirely different purposes. Valentinian ruled for 8 more years after the failed conspiracy, presiding over the empire's transformation with the same patient attention he brought to all his duties. He died in his sleep, peacefully, finally, in the spring of 455, and with him died the last emperor who could credibly claim to represent the traditions of Augustus and Trajan. The conspiracy's survivors pursued varied fates. Maximus eventually returned from his African exile and briefly held imperial power himself, though his reign lasted only months before ending violently in the chaos that followed Valentinian's death. Senator Avitus proved more durable, serving various successor regimes with the adaptive skill that had originally made him dangerous. Most of the others simply disappeared into the fog of historical obscurity, their names surviving only in the files that I maintained for an empire that no longer existed. As for myself, I continued to serve the imperial system until its final collapse, adapting my skills to each new regime that claimed authority over Rome's diminishing territories. I learned to prepare reports for Ostrogothic kings and Germanic warlords, to manage intelligence networks that served masters who spoke Latin with barbarian accents, to preserve the forms of Roman administration even as its substance evolved into something entirely new. But throughout all these transformations, I never forgot the lessons learned during that strange night when history pivoted on the sound of snoring. I learned that strength and weakness are often indistinguishable from each other until events reveal their true nature. I learned that the most effective forms of power are sometimes those that appear most vulnerable. I learned that survival often depends not on fighting change, but on understanding how to guide it. Most importantly, I learned that the men who shape history are rarely the ones who set out to do so. They are more often individuals who find themselves in positions where their small decisions have large consequences, who must choose between actions and inactions that they cannot fully predict or control. Valentinian never claimed to be a great emperor. He ruled during an age of diminished possibilities, when the best that could be hoped for was gradual decline rather than sudden collapse. But he understood his circumstances with remarkable clarity, and he adapted to them with a flexibility that preserved some version of Roman civilization long enough for it to evolve into new forms. The conspiracy that almost killed him failed not because it was poorly planned or inadequately executed, but because it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what imperial power had become. The conspirators expected to find traditional strength or weakness, and instead encountered something more complex. A ruler who had learned to find power in apparent powerlessness, effectiveness in seeming ineffectiveness. Their failure saved the empire for a few more years, but more importantly, it demonstrated principles of adaptation and survival that would prove useful long after the empire itself had passed into history. The barbarian kingdoms that replaced Roman rule often employed similar strategies, maintaining the appearance of weakness while building actual strength, accommodating change while preserving essential continuities, finding ways to rule through influence rather than domination. I often wonder what would have happened if the conspiracy had succeeded. Would Maximus have proven a more effective emperor? Would different policies have enabled the empire to survive longer or collapse more quickly? Would the transformation of Roman civilization have followed similar patterns under different leadership? Such questions cannot be answered, but they remind us that history is never as inevitable as it appears in retrospect. The Western Empire fell, but it fell in a particular way, at a particular time, for particular reasons. A different emperor, facing the same challenges, might have found different solutions, or might have failed more completely. What seems certain is that the age of empires built on military conquest and administrative domination was ending, whether Roman leaders acknowledged it or not. The future belonged to more flexible forms of organization, kingdoms that could adapt to local conditions, alliances that could shift as circumstances required, institutions that could evolve rather than simply enforce. Valentinian's great achievement was not that he prevented this transformation, but that he managed it with sufficient skill to preserve much of value from the old system while allowing new possibilities to emerge. His willingness to sleep deeply when sleep was needed and to wake fully when wakefulness was required became a metaphor for the kind of adaptive leadership that the age demanded. In the end, the emperor who slept through his own assassination attempt taught his subjects and his enemies that survival sometimes requires the courage to appear vulnerable, the wisdom to recognize when action and inaction serve the same purpose, and the faith that history's deepest currents often flow in channels too subtle for immediate perception. These lessons outlasted the empire that first learned them, passing into the common wisdom of European politics and remaining relevant wherever power must be exercised in circumstances that cannot be controlled through force alone. They remind us that the art of leadership is not always about imposing one's will upon events, but sometimes about understanding how to guide developments that cannot be stopped or reversed.